Welcome to your Pathocast.
Hey everyone, welcome to Future Focus. I'm Rowan, and with me as always is my brilliant co-host Alex.
Hi everyone. I'm excited about today's topic. It's a big one.
It really is. You know, Alex, when most people think about environmental leadership, China probably isn't the first country that comes to mind.
Well, they are the world's largest carbon emitter, right?
Exactly. But here's what's fascinating. China is actually orchestrating what might be the most ambitious environmental transformation in human history.
Wait, seriously? The same China that's responsible for about 30% of global carbon emissions?
The very same. They're completely reinventing their entire development model. We're talking about the world's second largest economy, essentially, pressing the reset button on how they approach everything from industry to urban planning.
That sounds almost too good to be true. How's that actually working out?
Well, that's what makes today's episode so interesting. We'll explore how China is becoming a global leader in green technology, their massive conservation efforts, and, yes, the very real challenges they're facing along the way.
And I guess we'll find out if they can really balance their industrial might with environmental protection.
Exactly. Get ready for a fascinating journey into what China calls their ecological civilization and what it means for our planet's future. So, Alex, to really understand what's happening in China today, we need to look at how their thinking about development has completely transformed over the past few decades.
Right, and I'm guessing this goes way beyond just putting up some solar panels and calling it a day.
Oh, absolutely. You know how we often talk about paradigm shifts? This is a perfect example. Let me take you back to the 1980s when China's philosophy was basically grow now, clean up later.
That sounds familiar. Isn't that pretty much what every industrializing country has done?
Exactly. Under Deng Xiaoping, the focus was purely on economic growth. The thinking was, get rich first, worry about everything else later.
And I'm guessing that later has finally arrived.
You could say that. But what's fascinating is how they're approaching it. They're not just adding environmental policies on top of their existing system. They're fundamentally reimagining what development means.
Okay, but how is this different from what other countries are doing with their green initiatives?
Well, think of it this way. Most countries treat environmental protection as one item on their to-do list. China has decided to rewrite the entire list. They're calling it ecological civilization.
That's quite a name. Sounds almost like science fiction.
It does, doesn't it? But here's what's interesting. The concept actually draws heavily from traditional Chinese philosophy, particularly the idea of harmony between humans and nature.
So they're basically combining ancient wisdom with modern policy?
Exactly. And what's really significant is that this isn't just nice words in a policy document. In 2018, they actually wrote ecological civilization into their constitution.
Wait, they put it in their constitution? That's pretty serious.
It is, and it's part of what they're calling Beautiful China 2025. Think of it as their roadmap for creating a society where economic progress and environmental protection go hand in hand.
I have to ask though, how much of this is real change versus just good PR?
That's a fair question. The proof is in their 5-year plans, which are the backbone of Chinese policymaking. Environmental targets are now given the same weight as economic ones. They're not optional extras anymore.
So they're actually putting their money where their mouth is?
And then some. China has become the world's biggest investor in green technology. They're spending more than the rest of the world combined.
That's actually incredible. But I'm curious about how this plays out in practice. Like, how do you convince an entire civilization to change course?
That's where it gets really interesting. They're approaching it from every angle: education, industry, urban planning, even art and culture. Everything is being realigned around this idea of ecological civilization.
It almost sounds like they're trying to create a whole new way of thinking.
That's exactly what they're doing. And while there are definitely challenges and skeptics, you can't deny the scale of their ambition. They're essentially trying to prove that a country can grow prosperous without destroying the environment.
And I suppose with China's size and influence, if they can pull this off,
it could change everything. We're watching what might be the biggest environmental experiment in human history unfold in real time.
Now that's something to think about.
You know what's really fascinating about this transformation, Alex? China isn't just talking about going green, but they're absolutely dominating the green technology sector.
Really? In what way? Big day.
Well, think about electric vehicle batteries. China currently controls 60% of the global market. That's not just leading, that's overwhelming dominance.
60%? That's incredible. How did they manage to get such a huge share of the market?
It's actually a perfect example of how China approaches these challenges. They combined massive state support with their manufacturing capabilities and the sheer scale of their domestic market. But here's what's even more interesting. They're not just focusing on one area.
What do you mean?
Well, take hydrogen technology, for instance. China now operates 40% of all hydrogen refueling stations worldwide.
I feel like we don't hear much about hydrogen stations. Why are they investing so heavily in that?
They're essentially hedging their bets. While most countries are going all in on one or two green technologies, China is developing everything simultaneously. Electric vehicles, hydrogen, solar, wind. They're pushing forward on all fronts.
That sounds expensive.
It is. But here's the thing. China is currently investing more in green technology than the rest of the world combined.
Wait, the entire rest of the world combined?
Yes, and it's not just about the money. They've created what you might call a green technology ecosystem. They've got the raw materials, the manufacturing capacity, the research facilities, and most importantly, the massive domestic market to test and refine these technologies.
So they're basically playing chess while everyone else is playing checkers?
That's a great analogy. And what's particularly clever is how they're using their domestic market as a launching pad. They perfect these technologies at home, scale them up, bring down the costs, and then export them globally.
But isn't there a risk in putting all these eggs in one basket? What if some of these technologies don't pan out?
That's the brilliant part. They're not putting all their eggs in one basket. They're developing multiple technologies simultaneously. If hydrogen vehicles don't take off as expected, they're still leading in electric vehicles. If one renewable energy source faces challenges, they have others ready to go.
I can see why other countries might be worried about this. It sounds like China could end up controlling the entire green technology sector.
That's definitely a concern many countries have. But there's also an interesting flip side to this. China's dominance is actually helping drive down the cost of green technology globally.
Oh, so everyone benefits?
In a way, yes. When China mass produces solar panels or batteries, the prices drop worldwide. This makes green technology more accessible to everyone, though it does create some interesting geopolitical dynamics.
I can imagine. But I'm curious about something. How are they managing to coordinate all of this?
They're using something called whole-of-nation approach. It's where government policy, industrial strategy, and research institutions all work together toward the same goal. When China decides to dominate a sector, they mobilize every resource at their disposal.
And I guess with their size and economic power, those are some pretty substantial resources.
Exactly. And they're not just throwing money at the problem. They're building entire supply chains, training workforces, creating research centers. It's a comprehensive approach that's really quite remarkable.
It almost sounds like they're creating a whole new industrial revolution, but a green one this time.
That's actually a perfect way to put it. And just like the original Industrial Revolution, whoever leads this green revolution will have enormous influence over the global economy in the coming decades.
And right now, that leader is clearly China.
Absolutely. Though, as we'll see next, this massive transformation hasn't been without its challenges. You know, Alex, while we've been talking about China's technological advances, there's another revolutionary program they've implemented that really shows how serious they are about environmental protection.
Oh, what's that?
It's called the Ecological Conservation Redline Policy. Think of it as drawing a giant red line around the most environmentally crucial areas in China and saying these areas are completely off limits for development.
That sounds ambitious. Like, how much land are we talking about?
Well, here's what's remarkable. This policy now protects 95% of China's crucial ecosystems. Every single state-designated wildlife habitat is included.
95%? That's huge. But, how do they actually enforce something like that in a country as big as China?
They're using some pretty sophisticated methods. They've created detailed ecological maps of the entire country, using satellite technology and artificial intelligence to monitor these protected areas in real time.
So they can actually see if someone's breaking the rules?
Exactly. But what's really interesting is how this policy has changed the way development projects are planned. It's not just about stopping harmful activities. It's about rethinking where and how development happens.
I can imagine that must create some interesting conflicts. Like, what happens when they find valuable resources in these protected areas?
That's where it gets fascinating. The policy actually trumps economic interest, even if they discover valuable minerals or prime real estate opportunities. If it's within the red line area, it's hands off.
Wait, so they're actually choosing environmental protection over economic development? That seems unlike the China we usually hear about.
It's a complete paradigm shift. But here's what makes it really special. They're not just preserving these areas, they're actively working to restore them.
How so?
Well, take the Los Plateau, for example. It's one of the most eroded places on Earth. Through careful ecological restoration, they've managed to transform vast areas of wasteland back into productive ecosystems.
That's incredible. But I have to ask, how do local communities feel about all this? I mean, some of them must have depended on these areas for their livelihoods.
That's a great question. The policy actually includes provisions for what they call ecological compensation. Communities that protect these areas can receive payments for ecosystem services.
So they're basically paying people to be environmental guardians?
Exactly, and it's creating new economic opportunities. Ecotourism, sustainable agriculture, green businesses. They're finding ways to make environmental protection economically viable.
I'm curious about something, though. How does this compare to conservation efforts in other countries?
Well, what makes China's approach unique is the scale and the legal force behind it. Most countries have protected areas, but few have implemented such comprehensive protection at a national level.
And I suppose having a centralized government makes it easier to implement something this big?
That's definitely part of it. But it's also about having a clear long-term vision. They're not just thinking about the next few years, they're planning for generations ahead.
It's kind of ironic. China was often criticized for environmental destruction, and now they're potentially setting new global standards for conservation.
It is ironic, and what's particularly interesting is how this policy is influencing other countries. Several nations are now looking at China's red line approach as a model for their own conservation efforts.
So this could actually have global implications?
Absolutely. It's showing that large-scale ecological protection isn't just possible, it's essential for sustainable development. And perhaps most importantly, it's demonstrating that economic growth and environmental protection aren't mutually exclusive.
That's quite a shift in thinking.
It really is, and it's just one part of China's larger environmental transformation. The real question now is whether they can maintain this momentum and fully achieve their ambitious goals. Alex, for all the impressive progress we've been discussing, there's another side to this story that we need to explore: the reality of implementing such massive changes on the ground.
I was wondering about that. It can't all be smooth sailing, right?
Not at all. Think about trying to transform the practices of millions of businesses and thousands of local governments across a country of 1.4 billion people.
When you put it that way, it sounds almost impossible.
And that's exactly the challenge China's facing. Local governments often have very different priorities from Beijing. Some are still focused on traditional economic metrics and view environmental regulations as obstacles.
So there's a disconnect between national policy and local implementation?
Exactly. Take carbon emissions reporting, for instance. Some local authorities have been caught underreporting their numbers to meet targets while actually continuing business as usual.
Oh, wow. That's pretty serious. How widespread is this problem?
It's hard to get exact figures, but there have been several high-profile cases. In 2023, authorities discovered that some steel plants were running at night to avoid emissions monitoring.
That's pretty clever, actually. In a completely wrong way, of course. But how do they catch things like that?
Well, that's where technology comes in. They're now using satellites, artificial intelligence, and real-time monitoring systems. But here's the interesting part. Sometimes the very industries they're trying to regulate are finding creative ways to work around these systems.
I guess when there's enough money at stake, people get pretty inventive.
Precisely. And there's another challenge we haven't discussed: the economic impact on traditional industries. Imagine you're running a coal power plant that's been operating for 30 years. Suddenly, you're told to completely transform your business model.
That must create some serious resistance.
It does, but here's what's fascinating. Some of these traditional industries are actually finding opportunities in the transition. There's a steel company in Hebei province that's completely reinvented itself as a producer of wind turbine components.
So they're turning the challenge into an opportunity?
Yes, but not everyone can adapt so successfully. Some smaller companies are really struggling with the cost of environmental compliance.
I suppose that's the hard reality of any major transformation. There are always winners and losers.
And that brings us to one of the biggest challenges: balancing environmental goals with social stability. The government has to manage this transition without causing too much economic disruption.
That sounds like walking a tightrope.
It really is. And you know what makes it even more complicated? International skepticism.
What do you mean?
Well, some countries view China's environmental data with suspicion. They question whether the reported progress matches reality.
And is there any merit to that skepticism?
It's complicated. While there are definitely implementation challenges, satellite data and independent monitoring show that China is making real progress in areas like air quality improvement and renewable energy adoption.
So the truth is somewhere in the middle?
Exactly. The transformation is real, but it's not as smooth or complete as official reports might suggest. It's a work in progress with both impressive achievements and significant hurdles to overcome.
Sounds like the biggest challenge isn't just creating the policies, but making sure they're actually followed.
That's right. And it's why China is constantly adjusting its approach, strengthening enforcement, improving monitoring systems, and creating better incentives for compliance.
I guess when you're trying to change an entire civilization's relationship with nature, you have to expect some bumps in the road.
And that might be the most important lesson from China's experience. Environmental transformation on this scale is incredibly complex, but not impossible. You know, Alex, while we've been focusing on what's happening within China, there's something even bigger at play here. The global ripple effects of China's environmental transformation.
Oh, like their influence on international climate goals?
Exactly. When China announced their dual carbon goals, reaching peak emissions by 2030 and carbon neutrality by 2060, it completely changed the global climate conversation.
Those are pretty ambitious targets for such a huge economy.
They are, and here's what's fascinating. When China makes a move like this, it creates what economists call a gravitational effect. Other countries, especially in Asia, tend to follow their lead.
I guess that makes sense. China's such a huge trading partner for most countries.
And that's exactly why this matters so much. China isn't just transforming itself, it's reshaping global supply chains. Think about it. If China demands green technology or sustainable materials, suppliers worldwide have to adapt.
So they're kind of forcing other countries to go green whether they want to or not?
In a way, yes, but it's creating some interesting tensions. Western countries are worried about becoming too dependent on Chinese green technology.
Like with those electric vehicle batteries we talked about earlier?
Precisely. And this is leading to what some are calling the green technology race. The United States and European Union are now pouring billions into developing their own green tech sectors.
So is this going to turn into another Cold War, but like a green one?
That's an interesting way to put it. Though I'd say it's more like a clean energy space race. Everyone wants to be the leader in tomorrow's green economy.
But isn't competition a good thing? Won't it drive innovation?
It definitely can. But here's the challenge. Climate change is a global problem that requires global cooperation. If countries get too competitive, it might actually slow down progress.
Oh, I hadn't thought about that. So how do we balance competition with cooperation?
That's the trillion-dollar question. Some experts suggest we need what they call co-petition, a mix of competition and cooperation. For instance, sharing basic research while competing on commercial applications.
And how's that working out so far?
Well, it's complicated. Take technology transfer, for example. Western countries want China to share its advances in battery technology, while China wants access to advanced semiconductor technology for smart grid management.
Sounds like everyone's holding their cards close to their chest.
True, but here's what's really interesting about China's approach. They're actually using their Belt and Road Initiative to export their environmental standards to other countries.
Wait, isn't that the huge infrastructure project they're doing across Asia and Africa?
Yes, and they've recently added what they call a Green Silk Road component. Any new projects have to meet strict environmental criteria.
So they're basically creating a green sphere of influence?
You could say that. And looking ahead to 2030 and beyond, this could reshape the global economic order. Whoever leads in green technology will have enormous influence over how other countries develop.
That's quite a shift from when China was seen as the world's biggest polluter.
It really is. And you know what's particularly fascinating? Some experts are suggesting that China's ecological civilization concept might become as influential as the Western model of industrial development was in the 20th century.
That's a pretty bold prediction.
It is, but consider this. If China successfully proves that rapid development and environmental protection can go hand in hand, it could become a model for developing nations worldwide.
I suppose we'll know in a few decades if they can pull it off.
And that might be the most important point. The success or failure of China's environmental transformation could determine the future of our planet's climate. We're all stakeholders in this experiment, whether we realize it or not.
Now that's something to think about.
You know, Alex, when we started this episode, we talked about how surprising it might seem that China has emerged as an environmental leader. But after exploring their ecological civilization concept, it actually makes perfect sense.
It really does. The sheer scale of what they're attempting is just mind-boggling, completely transforming the world's second largest economy while maintaining growth.
And that's what makes this so fascinating. We're not just watching an environmental policy shift, but we're witnessing the birth of a completely new development model.
Though I have to say the challenges they're facing seem pretty daunting, especially that gap between national goals and local implementation.
True, but what's remarkable is how they're using technology and policy innovations to bridge that gap. The ecological red line system alone is revolutionary in its scope.
And I suppose their dominance in green technology means they're not just talking about change, they're actually building the tools to make it happen.
Exactly. But you know what really strikes me? The global implications. If China succeeds, they'll have created a blueprint for sustainable development that other countries could follow.
And if they fail?
Well, that's what makes this so crucial. With China's size and influence, their environmental choices affect everyone on Earth. They're essentially running an experiment that could determine our planet's future.
So no pressure then.
You know what they say, the best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago. The second best time is now. China might have started late in the environmental game, but they're certainly making up for lost time.
Thanks for listening. If you liked this Pathacast, don't forget to share it with your friends. See you next time.